March 3, 1944, East Anglia, England. The winter wind howled through the hangars of Debden Airfield as Lieutenant William Overreet sat alone in his small wooden quarters. The low hum of generators outside mixed with the distant whine of aircraft engines being tested for the next day's mission. His pencil moved slowly across the paper, his hand trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. Tomorrow, he wrote to his sweetheart back in Virginia. We're doing something they all said was impossible. Tomorrow, he would fly his P-51 Mustang farther than any fighter had ever flown before, across occupied Europe, deep into the skies over Berlin, and somehow he would have to make it back. Through the frosted window he could see ground crews, working beneath harsh floodlights, strapping strange, silver-painted cylinders beneath the wings of the waiting Mustangs. They looked flimsy, almost laughable, like oversized tin cans or bundles wrapped in brown paper. Some of the men jokingly called them paper bags. When Overreet asked his crew chief if that was serious, the man had only grinned. They're laminated paper and plastic resin, Lieutenant. Same stuff the Brits have been using. They'll hold long enough to get you there and back. Few that night realized that these humble paper tanks were about to rewrite the mathematics of air warfare, not through armor or engine power, but through paper, glue, and ingenuity. The story began months earlier, on October 14, 1943, the day that would be remembered as Black Thursday. At Hailworth Airfield, Colonel Hubert Zena watched casualty reports arrive like funeral notices. 60 B-17s gone, 600 men lost in a single day. The target had been the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. But the Luftwaffe had been waiting. When the American P-47 Thunderbolts, limited by their fuel range, turned back, the German fighters swarmed. For 3 hours the bomber crews were sitting ducks. A ball turret gunner named Robert Morgan later said, "Once the little friends turned back, Jerry came at us in waves." The Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, but it could only reach 375 miles. Berlin was nearly twice that distance. The bombers were flying into death traps. Something had to change. In a small technical office at the 8th Air Force headquarters in Boyington, a colonel named Cass Hoof examined what looked more like a child's school project than a weapon of war, a fuel tank made entirely of laminated craft paper, bonded with resin and sealed with a special lacquer. The design came from Bowater Lloyd, a British company that once printed newspapers for the London Times. Britain had faced aluminum shortages early in the war and had improvised, turning paper mills into wartime laboratories. Their engineers discovered that resin-soaked paper could be molded into aerodynamic shapes, was light as a feather, and strong enough to carry high-octane aviation fuel for hours at a time. The Americans were skeptical, but desperate times demanded bold ideas. These new tanks weighed only 50 pounds empty, 1/3 of the metal kind, which meant more fuel, more range, and more possibilities. In February 1944, the first real test came. Major James Goodson of the 56th Fighter Group took his P-47 Thunderbolt aloft with a pair of the strange paper tanks strapped beneath its wings. He flew all the way to Hanover and back. No leaks, no failures. The skeptics were silenced. Then came the arrival of the sleek, fast, and efficient P-51B Mustang, a fighter with long legs and a hungry heart. Combined with the new 108-gallon paper tanks, its range leapt to over 850 miles. For the first time, a single-engine fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and home again. At 300 hours on March 4, 1944, the mission briefing at Debden Airfield began. A red line on the wall map stretched from East Anglia straight into the heart of Germany. When the pilot saw the line, the room fell silent. Then someone whispered, "Berlin." Outside, ground crews worked by lantern light, filling the paper tanks as carefully as if they were handling crystal. They had to be fast. Gasoline would slowly eat through the resin after 5 hours, but that was all the Mustangs needed. Each tank was made in 3 parts: a nose cone, a tail cone, and a laminated body, shaped by hand by women working in old newspaper factories across Britain. These were not machinists or engineers. They were paper mill workers, artists of texture and precision, turning their wartime labor into wings of salvation. When the first wave of Mustangs lifted off into the gray English dawn, no one knew if the tanks would hold. But they did, perfectly. Over Berlin, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe their eyes. American fighters over the Reich's capital. Their intelligence officers had sworn such a thing was impossible. From below, bomber gunners watched the contrails of the Mustangs glittering high above them. One gunner, Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group, remembered looking up from his turret and seeing the fighters dip their wings. "That's when we knew," he said, "we weren't alone anymore." From that day forward, everything changed. Bomber losses plummeted. Missions that had once been suicide runs to Schweinfurt or Regensburg now became achievable. By May 1944, monthly bomber loss rates fell from over 7% to barely 2%. Thousands of airmen lived because of a few hundred pounds of paper and glue. Engineers soon realized the paper tanks had other advantages too. They caused less drag than metal tanks, and when hit by enemy fire, they didn't explode. They simply tore open and leaked harmlessly. Even farmers after the war discovered they biodegraded into the soil, leaving almost nothing behind but a few metal fittings. Germany tried to copy the idea, but by then their war machine was collapsing. Their paper mills were printing maps. Their resin was reserved for aircraft. They lacked the industrial flexibility and the vast decentralized network of Allied production. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. Young German pilots went into combat with barely 50 hours of flight training. The Americans, with their paper-fed range, owned the skies. The Mustangs appeared over every battlefield, every rail yard, every city, and even over Berlin itself. Ace pilots like Francis Gabriski and Don Gentile flew mission after mission with paper tanks and swore by their reliability. Production soared. Bowater Lloyd's newspaper presses, once printing headlines, now rolled out laminated fuel tanks day and night. Women worked in 3 shifts, gluing, sealing, and painting tanks that would be used once and then discarded. Yet every single one carried the lives of bomber crews on its thin paper skin. The logistical advantages were extraordinary. The tanks were cheap, could be shipped flat, and even dropped by parachute to forward airfields. By the time of D-Day, Allied fighters operated from Normandy to Paris without pause. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, Mustangs could still launch 3 and 4 sorties a day. Their refueling system worked flawlessly, and the Luftwaffe's last desperate counterattacks were crushed from above. Captured German officers later admitted the truth. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann of the Luftwaffe told Allied interrogators, "The paper tank changed everything. It meant nowhere in the Reich was safe. With Allied fighters able to reach every corner of German airspace, fuel production sites were destroyed. Aircraft factories burned and the Luftwaffe starved." By late 1944, even the planes that rolled off the production lines had no gasoline to fly. General Adolf Galland, Germany's top ace, later said, "When the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost." The irony was bitter. An empire that built rockets and jet fighters was defeated by paper and glue. Yet this humble invention's legacy stretched beyond victory. The lamination techniques, developed for the paper tank, became the foundation for modern composite. Materials are the same. Principles used decades later in printed circuit boards, fiberglass, and carbon composites. Wing Commander Peter Brothers of the RAF summed it up best. The British gave the Americans the idea. The Americans gave it mass production. And together, they gave the bombers safe passage to Berlin. By 1945, over 15,000 paper tanks had been dropped across Europe, vanishing into the soil, forests, and rivers. They were disposable, forgotten, yet vital. In 1946, General James Doolittle stood before Congress and said, "The extension of fighter range through the British-made paper tanks was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe." And perhaps it was. From a newspaper mill in Kent to the skies above Berlin, the story of the paper drop tank remains a lesson in wartime ingenuity, a triumph of simplicity over complexity. Lieutenant Overeat, the young pilot who wrote that letter home, returned safely from the historic mission. His Mustang came back with empty wings, the paper tanks long gone, jettisoned somewhere over the German countryside. He never knew exactly where they fell, but he knew what they carried and the hope of thousands, the reach of freedom and proof that sometimes the simplest ideas, born of scarcity, can carry within them the fuel for victory.